Hello? Alrighty, we are back. Hope everyone remembers what happened in the last 7 chapters that we read in the first and second reading streams. I'm going to just get right into it and start our chapter 8. So, chapter 8. 1. Laura was easily roped in. Oh wait, I forgot something. I forgot our music. I should put that on. Sorry. Should have prepared this earlier. Music. Here we go. Okay. Let's see how this is. Yep, it seems alright. I'm gonna start reading now. So we have chapter 8. Chapter 8. 1. Blore was easily roped in. Blore was easily roped in. He expressed immediate agreement with their arguments. What you've said about those china figures, sir, makes all the difference. That's crazy, that is. There's only one thing. You don't think this Owen's idea might be to do the job by proxy, as it were? Explain yourself, man. Well, I mean like this. After the racket last night with this young Marston gets the wind-up and poisons himself. And Rogers, he gets the wind-up too and bumps off his wife, all according to UNO's plan. Armstrong shook his head. He stressed the point about the cyanide. Blore agreed. Yes, I'd forgotten that. Not a natural thing to be carrying about with you. But how did it get into his drink, sir? Lombard said. I've been thinking about that. Marston had several drinks that night. Between the time he had his last one and the time he finished the one before it, there was quite a gap. During that time, his glass was lying about on some table or other. I think, though I can't be sure, It was on the little table near the window. The window was open. Somebody could have slipped a dose of the cyanide into the glass. Blore said unbelievingly, "Without our all seeing him, sir." Lombard said dryly, "We were all rather concerned elsewhere." Armstrong said slowly, "That's true. We'd all been attacked. We were walking about, moving about the room, arguing, indignant, intent on our own business. I think it could have done better. No, I think it could have been done." Blore shrugged his shoulders. "Fact is, it must have been done. Now then, gentlemen, let's make a start. Nobody's got a revolver by any chance?" "I suppose that's too much to hope for," Lombard said. "I've got one." He patted his pocket. Blore's eyes opened very wide. He said in an over-casual tone, "Always carry that about with you, sir?" Lombard said, "Usually. I've been in some tight places, you know." "Oh," said Blore and added, "Well, you've probably never been in a tighter place than you are today. If there's a lunatic hiding on this island, he's probably got a young arsenal on him, to say nothing of a knife or a dagger or two." Armstrong coughed. "You may be wrong there, Blore. Many homicidal lunatics are very quiet, unassuming people. Delightful fellows." Blore said, "I don't feel this one is going to be of that kind, Dr. Armstrong." 2. The three men started on their tour of the island. It proved unexpectedly simple. On the northwest side towards the coast, the cliffs fell sheer to the sea below, their surface unbroken. On the rest of the island, there were no trees and very little cover. The three men worked carefully and methodically, beating up and down from the highest point to the water's edge, narrowly scanning the least irregularity in the rock which might point to the entrance to a cave. But there were no caves. They came at last, skirting the water's edge, to where General MacArthur sat looking out to sea. It was very peaceful here, with the lap of the waves breaking over the rocks. The old man sat very upright, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He paid no attention to the approach of the searchers. His oblivion of them made one at least faintly uncomfortable. Blore thought to himself, "'Tisn't natural. Looks as though he'd gone into a trance or something." He cleared his throat and said in a would-be conversational tone, "Nice peaceful spot you've found for yourself, sir." The general frowned. He cast a quick look over his shoulder. He said, "There is so little time. So little time. I really must insist that no one disturbs me." Blore said genially, "We won't disturb you. We're just making a tour of the island, so to speak. Just wondered, you know, if someone might be hiding on it." The general frowned and said, "You don't understand. You don't understand at all. Please go away." Blore retreated. He said, as he joined the other two, "He's crazy. It's no good talking to him." Lombard asked with some curiosity, "What did he say?" Blore shrugged his shoulders. Something about there being no time and that he didn't want to be disturbed. Dr. Armstrong frowned. He murmured, "I wonder now." 3. The search of the island was practically completed. The three men stood on the highest point looking over towards the mainland. There were no boats about. The wind was freshening. Lombard said, "No fishing boats about. There's a storm coming. Damn nuisance you can't see the village from here. We could signal or do something." Blore said, "We might light a bonfire tonight." Lombard said, frowning, "The devil of it is that's all probably been provided for." "In what way, sir?" "How do I know? Practical joke, perhaps. Were to be marooned here, no attention is to be paid to signals, etc. Possibly the village has been told there's a wager on. Some damn fool story anyway. Laura said dubiously. I think they'd swallow that? Lombard said dryly. It's easier of belief than the truth. If the village were told that the island was to be isolated until Mr. Unknown Owen had quietly murdered all his guests, do you think they'd believe that? Dr. Armstrong said, There are moments when I can't believe it myself. And yet, Philip Lombard, his lips curling back from his teeth, said, And yet, that's just it. You said it, Doctor. Flora was gazing down into the water. He said, Nobody could have clambered down here, I suppose. Armstrong shook his head. I doubt it. It's pretty sheer. And where could he hide? Flora said, There might be a hole in the cliff. If we had a boat now, we could row round the island, Lombard said. If we had a boat, we'd all be halfway to the mainland by now. True enough, sir, Lombard said suddenly. We can make sure of this cliff. There's only one place where there could be a recess. Just a little to the right below here. If you fellows can get a hold of a rope, you can let me down to make sure. Flora said, Might as well be sure, though it seems absurd on the face of it. I'll see if I can get a hold of something. He started off briskly down to the house. Lombard stared up at the sky. The clouds were beginning to mass themselves together. The wind was increasing. He shot a sideways glance look at Armstrong. He said, You're very silent, Doctor. What are you thinking? Armstrong said slowly, I was wondering exactly how mad old MacArthur was. 4. Vera had been restless all the morning. She had avoided Emily Brent with a kind of shuddering aversion. Miss Brent herself had taken a chair just round the corner of the house, so as to be out of the wind. She sat there knitting. Every time Vera thought of her, she seemed to see a pale, drowned face with seaweed entangled in the hair. A face that had once been pretty, impudently pretty perhaps, and which was now beyond the reach of pity or terror. And Emily Brent, placid and righteous, sat knitting. On the main terrace, Mr. Justice Wargrave sat huddled in a porter's chair. His head was pucked down well into his neck. When Vera looked at him, she saw a man standing in the dock, a young man with fair hair and blue eyes, and a bewildered, frightened face. Edward Seton. And in imagination she saw the judge's old hands put the black cap on his head and begin to pronounce sentence. After a while, Vera strolled slowly down to the sea. She walked along towards the extreme end of the island, where an old man sat staring out to the horizon. General MacArthur stirred at her approach. His head turned. There was a queer mixture of questioning and apprehension in his look. It startled her. He stared intently at her for a minute or two. She thought to herself, How queer. It's almost as though he knew. He said, Ah, it's you. You've come. Vera sat down beside him. She said, Do you like sitting here looking out to the sea? He nodded his head gently. Yes, he said. It's pleasant. It's a good place, I think, to wait. To wait? Said Vera sharply. What are you waiting for? He said gently, The end. But I think you know that, don't you? It's true, isn't it? We're all waiting for the end. She said unsteadily. What do you mean? General MacArthur said gravely. None of us are going to leave the island. That's the plan. You know it, of course, perfectly. What, perhaps you can't understand it's the relief? Vera said wonderingly. The relief? He said, Yes, of course. You're very young. You haven't got to that yet. But it does come, the blessed relief, when you know that you've done with it all. that you haven't got to carry the burden any longer. You'll feel that too, someday, Vera said hoarsely. I don't understand you. Her fingers worked spasmodically. She felt suddenly afraid of this quiet old soldier. He said musingly, You see, I loved Leslie. I loved her very much. Vera said questioningly. Was Leslie your wife? Yes, my wife. I loved her, and I was very proud of her. She was so pretty, and so gay. He was silent for a minute or two, then he said, Yes, I loved Leslie. That's why I did it. Vera said, You mean... and paused. General MacArthur nodded his head gently. It's not much good denying it now, not when we're all going to die. I sent Richmond to his death. I supposed, in a way, it was murder. Curious, murder, and I've always been such a law-abiding man. But it didn't seem like that at the time. I had no regrets. Serves him damned well, right? That's what I thought. But afterwards, in a hard voice, Vera said, Well, afterwards? He shook his head vaguely. He looked puzzled and a little distressed. I don't know. I don't know. It was all different, you see. I don't know if Leslie ever guessed. I don't think so. But, you see, I didn't know about her anymore. She'd gone far away where I couldn't reach her. And then she died. And I was alone. Vera said, Alone, alone. And the echo of her voice came back to her from the rocks. General MacArthur said, You'll be glad too, when the time comes. Vera got up. She said sharply, I don't know what you mean, he said. I know, my child. I know. You don't understand at all. General MacArthur looked out to the sea again. He seemed unconscious of her presence behind him. He said very gently and softly, Leslie? 5. When Bloor returned from the house with a rope coiled over his arm, he found Armstrong where he had left him, staring down into the depths. Bloor said breathlessly, Where's Mr. Lombard? Armstrong said carelessly, Gone to test some theory or other. He'll be back in a minute. Look here, Bloor. I'm worried. I should say we're all worried. Staring down into the depths. The doctor waved an impatient hand. Of course. I don't mean it that way. I'm thinking of old MacArthur. What about him, sir? Dr. Armstrong said grimly. What we're looking for is a madman. What price, MacArthur? Bloor said incredulously. You mean he's homicidal? Armstrong said doubtfully. I shouldn't have said so. Not for a minute. But of course I'm not a specialist in the mental diseases. I haven't really had any conversation with him. I haven't studied him from that point of view. Bloor said doubtfully. Gaga, yes. But I wouldn't have said. Armstrong cut in with a slight effort as of a man who pulls himself together. You're probably right. Damn it all, there must be something hiding on the island. Ah, here comes Lombard. They fastened the rope carefully. Lombard said, I'll help myself all I can. Keep a lookout for a sudden strain on the rope. After a minute or two, while they stood together watching Lombard's progress, Bloor said, Climbs like a cat, doesn't he? There was something odd in his voice. Dr. Armstrong said, I should think he must have done some mountaineering in his time. Maybe. There was a silence and the ex-inspector said, Funny sort of clove altogether. Do you know what I think? What? He's a wrong 'un. Armstrong said doubtfully. In what way? Blore grunted. Then he said, I don't know exactly, but I wouldn't trust him a yard. Dr. Armstrong said, I suppose he's led an adventurous life. Blore said, I bet some of his adventures have had to be kept pretty dark. He paused and then went on, Did you happen to bring a revolver along with you, Doctor? Armstrong stared. Me? Good Lord, no. Why should I? Blore said, Why did Mr. Lombard? Armstrong said doubtfully, I suppose habit. Blore snorted. A sudden pull came on the rope. For some moments they had their hands full. Presently, when the strain relaxed, Blore said, There are habits and habits. Mr. Lombard takes a revolver to out-of-the-way places. Right enough, and a Primus, and a sleeping bag, and a supply of bug powder, no doubt. But habit wouldn't make him bring the whole outfit down here. It's only in books people carry revolvers, around as a matter of course. Dr. Armstrong shook his head perplexedly. They leaned over and watched Lombard's progress. His search was thorough, and they could see at once that it was futile. Presently, he came up over the edge of the cliff. He wiped the perspiration from his head. Well, he said, we're up against it. It's the house or nowhere. Six. The house was easily searched. They went through the few outbuildings first and then turned their attention to the building itself. Mrs. Rogers' yard measure discovered in the kitchen dresser assisted them, but there were no hidden spaces left unaccounted for. Everything was plain and straightforward, a modern structure devoid of concealments. They went through the ground floor first. As they mounted to the bedroom floor, they saw through the landing window Rogers carrying out a tray of cocktails to the terrace. Philip Lombard said lightly, Wonderful animal, the good servant. Carries on with an impressive countenance. Armstrong said appreciatively, Rogers is a first-class butler. I'll say that for him, Blore said. Blore said, his wife was a pretty good cook too. That dinner, last night. They turned into the first bedroom. 5 minutes later, they faced each other on the landing. No one hiding. No possible hiding place. Blore said, there's a little stair here. Dr. Armstrong said, it leads up to the servants' room. Blore said, there must be a place under the roof for cisterns, water tank, etc. It's the best chance and the only one. And it was then, as they stood there, that they heard the sound from above, a soft, furtive footfall overhead. They all heard it. Armstrong grasped Blore's arm. Lombard held up an admonitory finger. Quiet. Listen. It came again, someone moving softly, furtively overhead. Armstrong whispered, he's actually in the bedroom itself, the room where Mrs. Rogers' body is. Blore whispered back, of course, best hiding place he could have chosen. Nobody likely to go there. Now then, quiet as you can. They crept stealthily upstairs. On the little landing outside the door of the bedroom, they paused again. Yes, someone was in the room. There was a faint creak from within. Blore whispered. Now! He flung open the door and rushed in, the other two close behind him. Then all three stopped dead. Rogers was in the room, his hand full of garments. 7. Blore recovered himself first. He said, Sorry, Rogers. I heard someone moving out in here and thought, well, he stopped. Rogers said. I'm sorry, gentlemen. I was just moving my things. I take it there will be no objection if I take one of the vacant guest chambers on the floor below, the smallest room. It was to Armstrong that he spoke, and Armstrong replied, Of course, get on with it. He avoided looking at the sheeted figure lying on the bed. Rogers said, Thank you, sir. He went out of the room with his arm full of belongings and went down the stairs to the floor below. Armstrong moved over to the bed and, lifting the sheet, looked down on the peaceful face of the dead woman. There was no fear there now, just emptiness. Armstrong said, Wish I'd got my stuff here. I'd like to know what drug it was. Then it turned to the other two. Let's get finished. I feel it in my bones. We're not going to find anything. Bloor was wrestling with the bolts of a low manhole. He said, That chap moves damned quietly. A minute or two ago we saw him in the garden. None of us heard him come upstairs, Lombard said. I suppose that's why we assumed it must be a stranger moving about up here. Bloor disappeared into a cavernous darkness. Lombard pulled a torch from his pocket and followed. 5 minutes later, 3 men stood on an upper landing and looked at each other. They were dirty and festooned with cobwebs, and their faces were grim. There was no one on the island but their 8 selves. Alright, that's the end of chapter 8. So, as usual, we're gonna take a break and I'll just change the music while we take a break. Oh my goodness, I just realized I started reading without unmuting my mic, and now I have to start again. For the release video, I might cut things out. Alright, here we go, I have to start again. I'll edit this in post. Okay, chapter 9. Let me mark down the time. Okay, chapter 9. 1. Lombard said slowly, "So we've been wrong all along. Built up a nightmare of superstition and fantasy, all because of the coincidence of 2 deaths," Armstrong said gravely. "And yet, you know, the argument holds. Hang it all. I'm a doctor. I know something about suicides." Anthony Marston wasn't a suicidal type. Lombard said doubtfully, "It couldn't, I suppose, have been an accident?" Blore snorted, unconvinced. "Damned queer sort of accident," he grunted. There was a pause. Then Blore said, "About the woman," and stopped. "Mrs. Rogers?" "Yes. It's possible, isn't it, that might have been an accident?" Philip Lombard said. "An accident? In what way?" Blore looked slightly embarrassed. His red-bricked face grew a little deeper in hue. He said, almost blurting out the words, "Look here, Doctor, you did give her some dope, you know." Armstrong stared at him. "Dope? What do you mean?" "Last night, you said yourself you'd given her something to make her sleep." "Oh, that, yes. A harmless sedative." "What was it exactly?" "I gave her a mild dose of Trianol. A perfectly harmless preparation." Oh, excuse me. Blore grew redder still. He said, "Look here, not to mince matters. You didn't give her an overdose, did you?" Dr. Armstrong said angrily, "I don't know what you mean." Blore said, "It's possible, isn't it, that you may have?" Armstrong made a mistake? These things do happen once in a while. Armstrong said sharply, I did nothing of the sort. The suggestion is ridiculous. He stopped and added in a cold, biting tone, Or do you suggest that I gave her an overdose on purpose? Philip Lombard said quickly, Look here, you two got to keep our heads. Don't let's start slinging accusations about. Blore said suddenly, I only suggested the doctor had made a mistake. Dr. Armstrong smiled with an effort. He said, showing his teeth in a somewhat mirthless smile. Doctors can't afford to make mistakes of that kind, my friend, Blore said deliberately. It wouldn't be the first you've made, if that gramophone record is to be believed. Armstrong went white. Philip Lombard said quickly and angrily to Blore, What's the sense of making yourself offensive? We're all in the same boat. We've got to pull together. What about your own pretty little spot of perjury? Blore took a step forward, his hands clenched. He said in a thick voice, Perjury be damned. That's a foul lie. You may try and shut me up, Mr. Lombard, but there are things I want you to know, and one of them is about you. Lombard's eyebrows rose. About me? Yes, I want to know why you brought a revolver down here on a pleasant social visit. Lombard said, You do you? Yes, I do. Mr. Lombard. Lombard said unexpectedly, You know, Blore, you're not nearly such a fool as you look. That's as may be. What about that revolver? Lombard smiled. I brought it because I expected to run into a spot of trouble. Blore said suspiciously, You didn't tell us that last night. Lombard shook his head. You were holding out on us? Blore persisted. In a way, yes, said Lombard. Well, come on, out with it. Lombard said slowly, I allowed you all to think that I was asked here in the same way as most of the others. That's not quite true. As a matter of fact, I was approached by a little man, Morris his name was. He offered me 100 guineas to come down here and keep my eyes open. Said I'd got a reputation for being a good man in a tight place. Well? Blore prompted impatiently. Lombard said with a grin. That's all, Dr. Armstrong said. But surely he told you more than that. Oh no, he didn't. Just shut up like a clam. I could take it or leave it. Those were his words. I was hard up. I took it. Blore looked unconvinced. He said, Why didn't you tell us this last night? My dear man, Lombard shrugged eloquent shoulders. How was I to know that last night wasn't exactly the eventuality I was here to cope with? I lay low and told a non-committal story. Dr. Armstrong said shrewdly, But now you think differently? Lombard's face changed. It darkened and hardened. He said, Yes, I believe now that I'm in the same boat as the rest of you. That 100 Guinness was just Mr. Owen's little bit of cheese to get me into the trap along with the rest of you. He said slowly, For we are in a trap. I'll take my oath on that. Mrs. Rogers' death, Tony Marston's, the disappearing soldier boys on the dinner table. Oh yes, Mr. Owen's hand is plainly seen, but where the devil is Mr. Owens himself? Downstairs, the gong pealed a solemn call to lunch. 2. Rogers was standing by the dining room door. As the three men descended the stairs, he moved a step or two forward. He said in a low, anxious voice, I hope lunch will be satisfactory. There is cold ham and cold tongue. And I've boiled some potatoes, and there's cheese and biscuits and some tinned fruits. Lombard said. Sounds all right. Stores are holding out then. There's plenty of food, sir, of a tinned variety. The larder is very well stocked. A necessity that, I should say, sir, on an island where one may be cut off from the mainland for a considerable period. Lombard nodded. Rogers murmured as he followed the three men into the dining room. It worries me that Fred Narracott hasn't been over today. It's peculiarly unfortunate, as you might say. Yes, said Lombard. Peculiarly unfortunate describes it very well. Miss Brent came into the room. She had just dropped a ball of wool and was carefully rewinding the end of it. As she took her seat at the table, she remarked, "The weather's changing. The wind is quite strong and there are white horses on the sea." Mr. Justice Wargrave came in. He walked with a slow measured tread. He darted quick looks from under his bushy eyebrows at the other occupants of the dining room. He said, "You have had an active morning." There was a faint malicious pleasure in his voice. Vera Claythorne hurried in. She was a little out of breath. She said quickly, "I hope you didn't wait for me. Am I late?" Emily Brent said, "You're not the last. The General isn't here yet." They sat round the table. Rogers addressed Miss Brent. "Will you begin, madam, or will you wait?" Vera said, "General MacArthur is sitting right down by the sea. I don't expect he would hear the gong there anyway." She hesitated. "He's a little vague today, I think." Rogers said quickly, "I will go down and inform him luncheon is ready." Dr. Armstrong jumped up. "I'll go," he said. "You others start lunch." He left the room. Behind him he heard Rogers's voice. "Will you take the cold tongue or cold ham, madam?" 3. The 5 people sitting round the table seemed to find conversation difficult. Outside, sudden gusts of wind came up and died away. Vera shivered a little and said, "There's a storm coming." Bloor made a contribution to the discourse. He said conversationally, "There was an old fellow in the train from Plymouth yesterday. He kept saying a storm was coming. Wonderful how they know weather, these old salts." Rogers went round the table collecting the meat plates. Suddenly, with the plates held in his hands, he stopped. He said in an odd, scared voice, "There's somebody running." They could all hear it, running feet along the terrace. In that minute they knew without being told. As by common accord, they all rose to their feet. They stood looking towards the door. Dr. Armstrong appeared, his breath coming fast. He said, "General MacArthur." "Dead," the word burst from Vera explosively. Armstrong said, "Yes, he's dead." There was a pause, a long pause. 7 people looked at each other and could find no words to say. So, my prediction last time was indeed correct. It was General MacArthur, next one to die, because, as per the nursery rhyme, we know, when there are 8 of them left, it's 8 little soldier boys travelling in Devon. One said he'd stay there, and then there was 7. And General MacArthur was the one who was adamant about, or he was pretty sure about, them not being able to leave the island. Although how he died would be interesting. Like, was it actually suicide in his case, maybe? Or did someone do something to him? So, Part 4. The storm broke just as the old man's body was borne in through the door. The others were standing in the hall. There was a sudden hiss and roar as the rain came down. As Bloor and Armstrong passed up the stairs with their burden, Vera Claythorne turned suddenly and went into the deserted dining room. It was as they had left it. The sweet course stood ready on the sideboard untasted. Vera went up to the table. She was there a minute or 2 later when Rogers came softly into the room. He started when he saw her. Then his eyes asked a question. He said, "Oh, miss, I just came to see." In a loud, harsh voice that surprised herself, Vera said, "You're quite right, Rogers. Look for yourself. There are only 7. 5. General MacArthur had been laid on his bed. After making a last examination, Armstrong left the room and came downstairs. He found the others assembled in the drawing room. Miss Brent was knitting. Vera Claythorne was standing by the window, looking out at the hissing rain. Bloor was sitting squarely in a chair, his hands on his knees. Lombard was walking restlessly up and down. At the far end of the room, Mr. Justice Walgrave was sitting in a grandfather chair. His eyes were half closed. They opened as the doctor came into the room. He said in a clear, penetrating voice, "Well, doctor?" Armstrong was very pale. He said, "No question of heart failure or anything like that. MacArthur was hit with a life preserver or some such thing on the back of the head." A little murmur went round, but the clear voice of the judge was raised once more. "Did you find the actual weapon used?" "No. Nevertheless, you are sure of your facts?" "I am quite sure." Mr. Justice Wargrave said quietly, We know now exactly where we are." There was no doubt who was in charge of the situation. This morning Wargrave had sat huddled in his chair on the terrace, refraining from any overt activity. Now he assumed command with the ease born of a long habit of authority. He definitely presided over the court. Clearing his throat, he once more spoke. "This morning, gentlemen, whilst I was sitting on the terrace, I was an observer of your activities. There could be little doubt of your purpose. You were searching the island for an unknown murderer?" "Quite right, sir," said Philip Lombard. The judge went on. "You had come, doubtless, to the same conclusion that I had, namely that the deaths of Anthony Marston and Mrs. Rogers were neither accidental nor were they suicides. No doubt you also reached a certain conclusion as to the purpose of Mr. Owen in enticing us to this island." Blore said hoarsely, "He's a madman, a loony." The judge coughed. "That almost certainly. But it hardly affects the issue. Our main preoccupation is this, to save our lives." Armstrong said in a trembling voice, "There's no one on the island, I tell you. No one." The judge stroked his jaw. He said gently, "In the sense you mean, no. I came to that conclusion early this morning. I could have told you that your search would be fruitless. Nevertheless, I am strongly of the opinion that Mr. Owen, to give him the name he himself has adopted, is on the island. Very much so. Given the scheme in question, which is neither more nor less than the execution of justice upon certain individuals for offences which the law cannot touch, there is only one way in which that scheme could be accomplished. Mr. Owen could only come to the island in one way. It is perfectly clear. Mr. Owen is one of us." 6. "Oh, no, no, no." It was Vera who burst out, almost in a moan. The judge turned a keen eye on her. He said, "My dear young lady, this is no time for refusing to look facts in the face. We are all in grave danger. One of us is U.N. Owen, and we do not know which of us. Of the 10 people who came to this island, 3 are definitely cleared. Anthony Marston, Mrs. Rogers, and General MacArthur have gone beyond suspicion. There are 7 of us left. Of those 7, one is, if I may so express myself, a bogus little soldier boy." He paused and looked around. "Do I take it that you all agree?" Armstrong said, "It's fantastic, but I suppose you're right." Blore said, "Not a doubt of it, and if you ask me, I've a very good idea." A quick gesture from Mr. Justice Wargrave's hand stopped him. The judge said quietly, "We will come to that presently. At the moment, all I wish to establish is that we are in agreement of the facts." Emily Brent, still knitting, said, "Your argument seems logical. I agree that one of us is possessed by a devil." Vera murmured, "I can't believe it. I can't." Wargrave said, "Lombard?" "I agree, sir. Absolutely." The judge nodded his head in a satisfied manner. He said, "Now, let us examine the evidence. To begin with, is there any reason for suspecting one particular person? Mr. Blore, you have, I think, something to say." Blore was breathing hard. He said, "Lombard's got a revolver. He didn't tell the truth. Last night. He admits it." Philip Lombard smiled scornfully. He said, "I suppose I'd better explain again." He did so, telling the story briefly and succinctly. Blore said sharply, "What's to prove it? There's nothing to corroborate on your story." The judge coughed. "Unfortunately," he said, "we are all in that position. There is only our own word to go upon." He leaned forward. Okay, I'm back now. Seems like I disconnected. So, just fixed my internet. Okay, I'm just going to continue a few lines before. "Unfortunately," he said, "we are all in that position. There is only our own word to go upon." He leaned forward. "You have none of you yet grasped what a very peculiar situation this is. To my mind, there is only one course of procedure to adopt. Is there anyone whom we can definitely eliminate from suspicion on the evidence which is in our possession?" Dr. Armstrong said quickly, "I am a well-known professional man. The mere idea that I can be suspected of—" Again, a gesture of the judge's hand arrested a speaker before he finished his speech. Mr. Justice Wargrave said in his small, clear voice, "I, too, am a well-known person. But, my dear sir, that proves less than nothing. Doctors have gone mad before, judges have gone mad. So," he added, looking at Blore, "have policemen." Lombard said, "At any rate, I suppose you'll leave the women out of it." The judge's eyebrows rose. He said in the famous acid tones that counsel knew so well, "Do I understand you to assert that women are not subject to homicidal mania?" Lombard said irritably, "Of course not, but all the same, it hardly seems possible." He stopped. Mr. Justice Wargrave, still in the same thin, sour voice, addressed Armstrong. "I take it, Dr. Armstrong, that a woman would have been physically capable of striking the blow that killed poor MacArthur." The doctor said calmly, "Perfectly capable, given a suitable instrument, such as a rubber truncheon or cosh. It would require no undue exertion of force." "Not at all." Mr. Justice Wargrave wriggled his tortoise-like neck. He said, "The other two deaths have resulted from the administration of drugs. That, no one will dispute, is easily encompassed by a person of the smallest physical strength." Seems like my connection's a little poor. I'm just gonna quickly test the audio just to see how well stream is going before I continue. Actually, no, I seem to be doing alright. I'm just gonna continue. Vera cried angrily, "I think you're mad." His eyes turned slowly till they rested on her. It was the dispassionate stare of a man well used to weighing humanity in the balance. She thought, "He's just seeing me as a specimen." And the thought came to her with a real surprise. "He doesn't like me much." In a measured tone, the judge was saying, "My dear young lady, do try and restrain your feelings. I am not accusing you." He bowed to Miss Brent. "I hope, Miss Brent, that you are not offended by my insistence that all of us are equally under suspicion. The idea that I should be accused of taking a fellow creature's life, not to speak of the lives of 3 fellow creatures, is, of course, quite absurd to anyone who knows anything of my character. But I quite appreciate the fact that we are all strangers to one another, and that in those circumstances nobody can be exonerated without the fullest proof. There is, as I have said, a devil among us." The judge said, "Then we are agreed. There can be no elimination on the ground of character or position alone." Lombard said, "What about Rogers?" The judge looked at him unblinkingly. What about him? Lombard said, Well, to my mind, Rogers seemed pretty well ruled out. Mr. Justice Wargrave said, Indeed, and on what grounds? Lombard said, He hasn't got the brains for one thing, and for another, his wife was one of the victims. The judge's heavy eyebrows rose once more. He said, In my time, young man, several people have come before me accused of the murders of their wives, and have been found guilty. Oh, I agree. Wife murder is perfectly possible. Almost natural, let's say. But not this particular kind. I can believe in Rogers killing his wife because he was scared of her breaking down and giving him away, or because he'd taken a dislike to her, or because he wanted to link up with some nice little bit rather less long in the tooth. But I can't see him as the lunatic Mr. Owen dealing out crazy justice and starting on his own wife for a crime they both committed. Mr. Justice Wargrave said, You are assuming hearsay to be evidence. We do not know that Rogers and his wife conspired to murder their employer. That may have been a false statement, made so that Rogers should appear to be in the same position as ourselves. Mrs. Rogers' terror last night may have been due to the fact that she realized her husband was mentally unhinged. Lombard said, Well, have it your way. U.N. Owen is one of us. No exceptions allowed. We all qualify. Mr. Justice Wargrave said, My point is that there can be no exceptions allowed on the score of character, position, or probability. What we must now examine is the possibility of eliminating one or more persons on the facts. To put it simply, there is among us one or more persons who could not possibly have administered either cyanide to Anthony Marston or an overdose of sleeping draught to Mrs. Rogers, and who had no opportunity to strike the blow that killed General MacArthur. Bloor's rather heavy face lit up. He leant forward. Now you're talking, sir, he said. That's the stuff. Let's get into it. As regards young Marston, I don't think there's anything to be done. It's already been suggested that someone from outside slipped something into the dregs of his glass before he refilled it for the last time. A person actually in the room could have done that even more easily. I can't remember if Rogers was in the room, but any of the rest of us could certainly have done it. He paused, then went on. Now, take the woman Rogers. The people who stand out there are her husband and the doctor. Either of them could have done it as easy as winking. Armstrong sprang to his feet. He was trembling. I protest. This is absolutely uncalled for. I swear that the dose I gave the woman was perfectly Dr. Armstrong. The small, sour voice was compelling. The doctor stopped with a jerk in the middle of his sentence. The small, cold voice went on. Your indignation is very natural. Nevertheless, you must admit that the facts have got to be faced. Either you or Rogers could have administered a fatal dose with the greatest ease. Now let us consider the position of the other people present. What chance had I, had Inspector Bloor, had Miss Brent, had Miss Claythorne, had Mr. Lombard of administering poison? Can any one of us be completely and entirely eliminated? He paused. I think not. Vera said angrily, I was nowhere near the woman. All of you can swear that. Mr. Justice Wargrave waited a minute. Then he said, As far as my memory serves me, the facts were these. Will anyone please correct me if I make a misstatement? Mrs. Rogers was lifted onto the sofa by Anthony Marston and Mr. Lombard, and Dr. Armstrong went to her. He sent Rogers for brandy. There was then a question raised as to where the voice we had just heard had come from. We all went into the next room with the exception of Miss Brent, who remained in this room, alone with the unconscious woman. A spot of color came into Emily Brent's cheek. She stopped knitting. She said, This is outrageous. The remorseless small voice went on. When we returned to this room, you, Miss Brent, were bending over the woman on the sofa. Emily Brent said, "Is common humanity a criminal offence?" Mr. Justice Walgrave said, "I am only establishing facts." Rogers then entered the room with the brandy which, of course, he could quite well have doctored before entering the room. The brandy was administered to the woman, and shortly afterwards her husband and Dr. Armstrong assisted her up to bed, where Dr. Armstrong gave her a sedative. Blora said, "That's what happened." "Absolutely, and that lets out the judge, Mr. Lombard, myself, and Miss Claythorne." His voice was loud and jubilant. Mr. Justice Walgrave, bringing a cold eye to bear upon him, murmured, "Ah, but does it? We must take into account every possible eventuality." Blora stared. He said, "I don't get you." Mr. Justice Walgrave said, "Upstairs in her room, Mrs. Rogers is lying in bed. The sedative that the doctor has given her begins to take effect. She is vaguely sleepy and acquiescent. Supposing that at that moment there is a tap on the door and someone enters bringing her, shall we say, a tablet or a draught with the message that the doctor says you're to take this. Do you imagine for 1 minute that she would not have swallowed it obediently without thinking twice about it?" There was a silence. Blore shifted to his feet and frowned. Philip Lombard said, "I don't believe in that story for a minute. Besides, none of us has left this room for hours. Afterwards, there was Marston's death and all the rest of it." The judge said someone could have left his or her bedroom later. Lombard objected. "But then Rogers would have been up there." Dr. Armstrong stirred. "No," he said. "Rogers went downstairs to clear up in the dining room and pantry. Anyone could have gone up to the woman's bedroom then without being seen." Emily Brent said, "Surely, doctor, the woman would have been fast asleep by then, under the influence of the drug you had administered." "In all likelihood, yes, but it's not a certainty. Until you have prescribed for a patient more than once, you cannot tell their reaction to different drugs. There is sometimes a considerable period before a sedative takes effect. It depends on the personal idiosyncrasy of the patient towards a particular drug." Lombard said, "Of course you would say that, doctor. Suits your book, eh?" Again, Armstrong's face darkened with anger. But again, that passionless, cold little voice stopped the words on his lips. "No good result can come from recrimination. Facts are what we have to deal with. It is established, I think, that there is a possibility of such a thing as I have outlined occurring. I agree that its probability value is not high, though there again it depends on who that person might have been. The appearance of Miss Brent or of Miss Claythorne on such an errand would have occasioned no surprise in the patient's mind. I agree that the appearance of myself or of Mr. Blore or of Mr. Lombard would have been, to say the least of it, unusual, but I still think the visit would have been received without the awakening of any real suspicion." Blore said, "And that gets us where?" 7. Mr. Justice Walgrave, stroking his lip and looking quite passionless and inhumane, said, "We have now dealt with the second killing, and have established the fact that no one of us can be completely exonerated from suspicion." He paused and went on. "We come now to the death of General MacArthur that took place this morning. I will ask anyone who considers that he or she has an alibi to state it in so many words. I myself will state at once that I have no valid alibi. I spent the morning sitting on the terrace and meditating on the singular position in which we all find ourselves. I sat on that chair on the terrace for the whole morning until the gong went, but there were, I should imagine, several periods during the morning when I was quite unobserved, and during which it would have been possible for me to walk down to the sea, kill the general, and return to my chair. There is only my word for the fact that I never left the terrace. In the circumstance, that is not enough. There must be proof." Blore said, "I was with Mr. Lombard and Dr. Armstrong all the morning. They'll bear me out." Dr. Armstrong said, "You went to the house for a rope." Blore said. Of course I did. Went straight there and straight back. You know I did. Armstrong said. You were a long time. Blore turned crimson. He said, What the hell do you mean by that, Dr. Armstrong? Armstrong repeated, I only said you were a long time. Had to find it, didn't I? Can't lay your hands on a coil of rope all in a minute. Mr. Justice Wargrave said, During Inspector Blore's absence, were you two gentlemen together? Armstrong said hotly, Certainly. That is, Lombard went off for a few minutes. I remained where I was. Lombard said with a smile, I wanted to test the possibilities of heliographing to the mainland. Wanted to find the best spot. I was only absent a minute or two. Armstrong nodded. He said, That's right. Not long enough to do a murder, I assure you. The judge said, Did either of you two glance at your watches? Well, no. Philip, Lombard said. I wasn't wearing one, the judge said evenly. A minute or two is a vague expression. He turned his head to the upright figure with the knitting lying on her lap. Miss Brent? Emily Brent said, I took a walk with Miss Claythorne up to the top of the island. Afterwards I sat on the terrace in the sun. The judge said, I don't think I noticed you there. No, I was round the corner of the house to the east. It was out of the wind there. And you sat there till lunchtime? Yes. Miss Claythorne? Vera answered readily and clearly. I was with Miss Brent early this morning. After that I wandered about a bit. Then I went down and talked to General MacArthur. Mr. Justice Wargrave interrupted. He said, What time was that? Vera, for the first time, was vague. She said, I don't know, about an hour before lunch, I think, or it might have been less. Blore asked, Was it after we'd spoken to him or before? Vera said, I don't know, he was very queer. She shivered. In what way was he queer? The judge wanted to know. Vera said in a low voice, He said we were all going to die. He said he was waiting for the end. He frightened me. The judge nodded. He said, What did you do next? I went back to the house. Then, just before lunch, I went out again and up behind the house. I've been terribly restless all day. Mr. Justice Wargrave stroked his chin. He said, The remains of Rogers, though I doubt if his evidence will add anything to our sum of knowledge. Rogers, summoned before the court, had very little to tell. He had been busy all the morning about household duties and with the preparation of lunch. He had taken cocktails onto the terrace before lunch and had then gone up to remove his things from the attic to another room. He had not looked out of the window during the morning and had been nothing that could have any bearing upon the death of General MacArthur. He would swear definitely that there had been 8 china figures upon the dining table when he laid the table for lunch. At the conclusion of Rogers' evidence, there was a pause. Mr. Justice Wargrave cleared his throat. Lombard murmured to Vera Claythorne, The summing up will now take place. The judge said, We have inquired into the circumstances of these 3 deaths to the best of our ability. Whilst probability in some cases is against certain people being implicated, yet we cannot say definitely that any one person can be considered as cleared of all complicity. I reiterate my positive belief that of the 7 persons assembled in this room, 1 is a dangerous and probably insane criminal. There is no evidence before us as to who that person is. All we can do at the present juncture is to consider what measures we can take up for communicating with the mainland for help, and in the event of help being delayed, as is only too possible given the state of the weather, what measures we must adopt to ensure our safety. I would ask you all to consider this carefully, and to give me any suggestions that may occur to you. In the meantime, I warn everybody to be upon his or her guard. So far, the murderer has had an easy task. Since his victims have been unsuspicious, from now on it is our task to suspect each and every one among us. Forewarned is forearmed. Take no risks and be alert to danger. That is all. Philip Lombard murmured beneath his breath, The court will now adjourn. And that is the end of chapter 9. Again, we're gonna take a break. So the next one is about, as in the next line in the nursery rhyme goes, 7 little soldier boys chopping up 6. One chops himself in half, and then there was 6. So someone gets hit with an axe. This jazz music's pretty loud, isn't it? Okay. I should probably get back to the book. I keep forgetting to change my screen and audio stuff. Well, good thing I'm doing this. Learning as we go, right? So, chapter 10 now. Chapter 10. 1. Do you believe it? Vera asked. She and Philip Lombard sat on the windowsill of the living room. Outside, the rain poured down and the wind howled in great shuddering gusts against the window panes. Philip Lombard cocked his head slightly on the one side before answering. Then he said, You mean, do I believe that old Wargrave is right when he says it's one of us? Yes, Philip Lombard said slowly. It's difficult to say. Logically, you know he's right. And yet... Vera took the words out of his mouth. And yet it seems so incredible. But after MacArthur's death, there's no more doubt as to one thing. There's no question now of accidents or suicides. It's definitely murder. 3 murders up to date. Vera shivered. She said, It's like some awful dream. I keep feeling that things like this can't happen. He said with understanding, I know. Presently a tap will come on the door, and early morning tea will be brought in, Vera said. Oh, how I wish that could happen. Philip Lombard said gravely. Yes, but it won't. We're all in the dream, and we've got to be pretty much upon our guard from now on, Vera said, lowering her voice. If it is one of them, which do you think it is? Philip Lombard grinned suddenly. He said, I take it you're expecting our 2 selves? Well, that's all right. I know very well that I'm not the murderer, and I don't fancy that there's anything insane about you, Vera. You strike me as being one of the sanest, most level-headed girls I've come across. I'd stake my reputation on your sanity. With a slightly wry smile, Vera said, Thank you, he said. Come now, Miss Vera Claythorne. Aren't you going to return the compliment? Vera hesitated a minute. Then she said, You've admitted, you know, that you don't hold human life particularly sacred, but all the same I can't see you as the man who dictated that gramophone record. Lombard said, Quite right. If I were to commit one or more murders, it would be solely for what I could get out of them. This mass clearance isn't my line of country. Good, then we'll eliminate ourselves and concentrate on our 5 fellow prisoners. Which of them is U.N. Owen? Well, at a guess, and with absolutely nothing to go upon, I'd plumb for Wargrave. Oh, Vera sounded surprised. She thought a minute or two and then said, Why? Hard to say exactly, but to begin with, he's an old man and he's been presiding over courts of law for years. That is to say, he's played God Almighty for a good many months every year. That must go to a man's head. Eventually, he gets to see himself as all-powerful, as holding the power of life and death, and it's possible that his brain might snap and he might want to go one step further and be executioner and judge extraordinary. Vera said slowly. Yes, I suppose that is possible, Lombard said. Who do you plump for? Without any hesitation, Vera answered, Dr. Armstrong. Lombard gave a low whistle. The doctor, eh? You know, I should have put him last of all. Vera shook her head. Oh no! The 2 of the deaths have been poisoned. That rather points to a doctor. And then you can't get over the fact that the only thing we are absolutely certain Mrs. Rogers had was the sleeping draught that he gave her. Lombard admitted. Yes, that's true. Vera persisted. If a doctor went mad, it would be a long time before anyone suspected. And doctors overwork and have a lot of strain. Philip Lombard said. Yes, but I doubt if he could have killed MacArthur. He wouldn't have had time during the brief interval when I left him. Not, that is, unless he fairly hared down there and back again. And I doubt if he's in good enough training to do that and shows no sign of it. Vera said. He didn't do it then. He had an opportunity later. When he went down to call the general to lunch. Philip whistled again very softly. He said, So you think he did it then? Pretty cool thing to do, Vera said impatiently. What risk was there? He's the only person here with medical knowledge. He can swear the body's been dead at least an hour, and who's to contradict him? Philip looked at her thoughtfully. You know, he said, that's a clever idea of yours. I wonder. 2. Who is it? Mr. Bloor? That's what I want to know. Who is it? Roger's face was working. His hands were clenched around the polishing leather that he held in his hand. Ex-Inspector Bloor said, my lad, that's the question. One of us, his lordship said. Which one? That's what I want to know. Who's a fiend in human form? That said, Bloor, is what we all would like to know, Roger said shrewdly. But you've got an idea, Mr. Bloor. You've got an idea, haven't you? I may have an idea, but Bloor said slowly. That's a long way from being sure. I may be wrong. All I can say is that if I'm right, the person in question is a very cool customer. A very cool customer indeed. Rogers wiped perspiration from his forehead. He said hoarsely, It's like a bad dream, that's what it is. Bloor said, looking at him curiously. Got any ideas yourself, Rogers? The butler shook his head. He said hoarsely, I don't know. I don't know anything. I don't know at all. And that's what's frightening the life out of me. To have no idea. 3. Dr. Armstrong said violently, We must get out of here. We must. At all costs. Mr. Justice Wargrave looked thoughtfully out of the smoking room window. He played with the cord of his eyeglasses. He said, I do not, of course, profess to be a weather prophet, but I should say that it is very unlikely that a boat could reach us, even if they knew of our plight. Under 24 hours, and even then, if only the wind drops. Dr. Armstrong dropped his head in his hands and groaned. He said, "And in the meantime, we may all be murdered in our beds." "I hope not," said Mr. Justice Walgrave. "I intend to take every possible precaution against such a thing happening." It flashed across Dr. Armstrong's mind that an old man like the judge was far more tenacious of life than a younger man would be. He had often marveled at the fact in his professional career. Here was he, junior to the judge by perhaps 20 years, and yet with a vastly inferior sense of self-preservation. Mr. Justice Walgrave was thinking, "Murder in our beds, these doctors are all the same. They think in cliches. A thoroughly commonplace mind." The doctor said, "There have been 3 victims already, remember?" "Certainly, but you must remember that they were unprepared for the attack. We are forewarned." Dr. Armstrong said bitterly, "What can we do? Sooner or later." "I think," said Mr. Walgrave, "that there are several things we can do." Armstrong said, "We've no idea even who it can be." The judge stroked his chin and murmured, "Oh, I wouldn't quite say that." Armstrong stared at him. "Do you mean you know?" Mr. Justice Walgrave said cautiously, "As regards actual evidence, such as is necessary in court, I admit that I have none. But it appears to me, reviewing the whole business, that one particular person is sufficiently clearly indicated." "Yes, I think so." Armstrong stared at him. He said, "I don't understand." 4. Miss Brent went upstairs in her bedroom. She took up her Bible and went to sit by the window. She opened it. Then, after a minute's hesitation, she set it aside and went over to the dressing table. From a drawer in it, she took out a small black-covered notebook. She opened it and began writing. "A terrible thing has happened. General MacArthur is dead. His cousin married Elise McPherson. There is no doubt but that he was murdered. After luncheon, the judge made us a most interesting speech. He is convinced that the murderer is one of us. That means that one of us is possessed by a devil. I had already suspected that. Which of us is it? They were all asking themselves that. I alone know." She sat for some time without moving. Her eyes grew vague and filmy. The pencil straggled drunkenly in her fingers. In shaking loose capitals, she wrote, "The murderer's name is Beatrice Taylor." Her eyes closed. Suddenly, with a start, she woke. She looked down at the notebook. With an angry exclamation, she scored through the vague, unevenly scrawled characters of the last sentence. She said in a low voice, "Did I write that? Did I? I must be going mad." 5. The storm increased. The wind howled against the side of the house. Everyone in the living room. They sat listlessly huddled together, and surreptitiously they watched each other. When Rogers brought in the tea tray, they all jumped. He said, "Shall I draw the curtains? It would make it more cheerful-like." Receiving an assent to this, the curtains were drawn and the lamps turned on. The room grew more cheerful. A little of the shadow lifted. Surely by tomorrow the storm would be over and someone would come. A boat would arrive. Vera Claythorne said, "Will you pour out tea, Miss Brent?" The elder woman replied, "No, you do it, dear. That teapot is so heavy, and I have lost 2 skeins of my grey knitting wool. So annoying." Vera moved to the tea table. There was a cheerful rattle and a clink of china. Normality returned. "Tea! Less ordinary everyday afternoon tea." Philip Lombard made a cheery remark. Bloor responded. Dr. Armstrong told a humorous story. Mr. Justice Walgrave, who ordinarily hated tea, sipped approvingly. Into this relaxed atmosphere came Rogers, and Rogers was upset. He said nervously and at random, "Excuse me, sir, But does anyone know what's become of the bathroom curtain? Lombard's head went up with a jerk. The bathroom curtain? What the devil do you mean, Rogers? It's gone, sir. Clean vanished. I was going round drawing all the curtains, and the one in the bathroom wasn't there any longer. Mr. Justice Walgrave asked, Was it there this morning? Oh, yes, sir. Blora said, What kind of curtain was it? Scarlet oil silk, sir. It went with the scarlet tiles. Lombard said, And it's gone? Gone, sir. They stared at each other. Blora said heavily, Well, after all, what of it? It's mad, but so's everything else. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You can't kill anybody with an oil silk curtain. Forget about it. Rogers said, Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. He went out, shutting the door behind him. Inside the room, a pall of fear had fallen anew. Again, surreptitiously, they watched each other. 6. Dinner came, was eaten, and cleared away. A simple meal, mostly out of tins. Afterwards, in the living room, the strain was almost too great to be borne. At 9 o'clock, Emily Brent rose to her feet. She said, I'm going to bed, Vera said. I'll go to bed too. The two women went up the stairs, and Lombard and Blora came with them, standing at the top of the stairs. The two men watched the women go into their respective rooms and shut the doors. They heard the sounds of two bolts being shot and the turning of two keys. Blora said with a grin, No need to tell them lock their doors, Lombard said. Well, they're all right for the night at any rate. He went down again, and the other followed him. 7. The four men went to bed an hour later. They went up together. Rogers, from the dining room where he was setting the table for breakfast, saw them go up. He heard them pause on the landing above. Then the judge's voice spoke. I need hardly advise you, gentlemen, to lock your doors, Blora said. And what's more, put a chair under the handle. There are ways of turning locks from the outside. Lombard murmured, My dear Blora, the trouble with you is you know too much. The judge said gravely, Good night, gentlemen. May we all meet safely in the morning. Rogers came out of the dining room and slipped halfway up the stairs. He saw 4 figures pass through 4 doors and heard the turning of 4 locks and the shooting of 4 bolts. He nodded his head. That's all right, he muttered. He went back into the dining room. Yes, everything was ready for the morning. His eye lingered on the center plaque of looking-glass and the 7 little china figures. A sudden grin transformed his face. He murmured, I'll see no one play tricks tonight at any rate. Crossing the room, he locked the door to the pantry. Then going through the other door to the hall, he pulled the door to, lock it, and slipped the key into his pocket. Then, extinguishing the lights, he hurried up the stairs and into his new bedroom. There was only one possible hiding place in it, the tall wardrobe, and he looked into that immediately. Then, locking and bolting the door, he prepared for bed. He said to himself, No more China soldier tricks tonight. I've seen to that. And that is end of chapter 10. So there are a lot of interruptions today. I might cut them out if I'm bothered. But yeah, I have been technically streaming for 2 hours now, even though the total content of the story is a lot less than that. Probably like 1.5 hours, I reckon. But yeah, we've made it to chapter 11. I think we're about halfway through the book. 96 out of 183. 96, 183. Yeah, we're like 52% of the way through. Five, 2. Sorry for choppy reading this time. Yeah, found it a bit hard to be fully engaged and do some proper acting. Guess that's alright. So, considering we're halfway through, and this is our third reading stream, it would make sense that we would take 3 more streams to finish this book. It's quite a bit of reading. What's that, 6 more hours of reading? That's okay. I've committed to this. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I don't have much to say for now. So it's 7 people left. 3 people dead. Actually, we can take a guess at who the killer is. So far they've theorized that Ewan Owens is one of them. According to the poem, the last one got frizzled up and then there were none. So 10 people die, and I think, if I remember correctly, in the author's note or something, it did say 10 people die, so all of them do die. I mean, honestly, I'm guessing one of them, like, I'm guessing the Owens guy. He might be, that boat guy? Narcot or something? He could be Owen, and then he probably know the property well. Maybe there's like a secret storage or something, and he hides there. Although we don't know where the boat is. But yeah, I feel like it's not actually any of them, because you know we get insights into their perspectives occasionally. We kind of know, unless it's misleading us. But yeah, I don't know, I just feel like it's not any of them. That's my guess. There's like an 11th person. But yeah. Well, we will find out. Oh, excuse me. Again. Anyways, I think that's it today. Thanks for joining me. Next stream is probably next week, honestly. Probably next week. Yep, okay. Well, bye for now. See you next time. Take care, everybody.